Hello, everybody. Hi.
Hello.
Great to see you all. Really great to see you all. But we will start. We've got a lot to get through in a couple of hours. I'm just over the moon that you're all here to spend some time talking about Violation Tracker and why it's coming to the UK. So I will cover off introductions first of all, because there's some of you who've not been to a Transparency Task Force event before. So I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are a certified social enterprise, which means that we exist to make an impact as opposed to existing to make money. We're a rather unusual organization. We've been around for 5 years. I've built it from scratch. I'm very proud to have done that. When I think of the Transparency Task Force, I think about that famous quotation by Mark Twain. The two most important days in a man's life are the day he was born and the day he figured out why. And for me, that was the 6th of May 2015, when I was able to talk about the need for radical reform of the financial services sector. I did that at an event I ran at one of the major London universities. The event went down really well. The speech went down very well. What I didn't expect it to do was to completely change my life, because having given that speech, I ended up taking a completely different direction. I stopped being a successful entrepreneur type person, working 3 days a week and earning a great living, to now working 7 days a week, not earning so much, but being very rich in every way that really matters. I've never been so fulfilled in my life in terms of the work that I do. I absolutely love the work that I do. And the reason I love the work that I do is really easy to understand. And I'm going to share my screen to try to bring some of this to life to you. This is really for the folks who don't know much about the Transparency Task Force at all. So we are this certified social enterprise. We operate through 25 groups. The reason I'm saying it with a sense of emphasis is because it only seems like yesterday when we just had one group. We've now got 25 groups. Every one of our groups is built around the idea that is expressed so brilliantly in this very famous Margaret Mead quotation: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So the Transparency Task Force is effectively a cluster of 25 groups of committed, passionate people. We do have a strategy for driving change. And while I'm talking, I'm going to be scrolling down just to give you a feel for the different groups that we have. We do have a strategy for driving change. It's very clear, it's very specific, it's very important. It stops us being just a talking shop, and it means we actually exist to make a real live difference in the real world. Our strategy for driving change is to bring together the thinking of two types of people. On one hand, there are people like me and our members who have, as we describe it, a sense of passion and purpose for the change that we want to see. And on the other hand, the other group, those that we characterize as having the power and the position to make change possible, by which we mean the politicians, the parliamentarians, the regulators, the policymakers. And here's a good example of this. Here's a good example of us bringing this strategy to life. You're looking at the all-party parliamentary group for pension scams. Pension scams is a huge problem in the UK. It is the Transparency Task Force that initiated the creation of that all-party parliamentary group. We've gone on to open an inquiry about the pension scams problem, etc. This is a really good way of showing how we bring people together to make a difference. Those with a sense of passion and purpose for the change we want to see, and those who have the power and the position to make change possible. Here's another very good example, a second all-party parliamentary group that we run, all about personal banking and fairer financial services. Some of our groups have got such exciting projects on the go. For example, institution, our females that is dedicated to making sure that for fairer financial services has got a project on the go all about studying and researching and campaigning around the injustices what we're all about in the pension systems around the world against females. It's a big problem. It really is a big problem. So lots and lots of different groups, 25 of them all together. every single one of our groups has got an important, focused, specific, reasonably well organized campaign objective on the go. And we're very, very, very proud of the work we're doing through our groups. Now, I guess you might half expect me to say this, but in all honesty, the one group that we have that gives me more excitement than any other is our Violation Tracker group. We stumbled across Violation Tracker last year, about a year ago, if I remember rightly. We stumbled across it because we were writing a book. Very pleased to say that book's gone down pretty well. In fact, here it is. I can show you a real book that we wrote and published. It's rather special for a couple of reasons. It's special because there were 64 people around the world who contributed to working on this book with me. Why we must rebuild trustworthiness and confidence in financial services, and how we can do it. No time to explain the graphic at the front, but there's a really good story behind that for when we've got a bit more time. I'm very pleased to say that some of the contributors to the book include the people at Violation Tracker. I stumbled across it when I was doing some research for the book, specifically around how Wells Fargo, this massive, old, established, trusted bank, had lost its way, let's be polite, had lost its way, and had started to systematically create false bank accounts to show high sales penetration, which positively impacted share price, which positively impact chief exec's bonuses. He earned millions and millions and more than he would have done otherwise. And that information was there inside Violation Tracker. I was able to go into it, to see it, to understand it. And I'm going to spend a few moments now demonstrating Violation Tracker. It's only going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the database, but it's so easy to use. It's so accessible. Even I, and I mean this generally, even I find it easy peasy to navigate my way around. So this is really for those of you that aren't yet familiar with Violation Tracker. It does exactly as it describes. It does exactly as it describes. It enables you to discover which corporations are the biggest regulatory violators and lawbreakers throughout the United States. It hoovers together, that makes it sound easy. It's a lot of hard work, as others will say on this tonight's session. It hoovers together information from many, many different agencies to bring together 483,000 civil and criminal cases from more than 300 agencies, with penalties of $667 billion, not million, $1 billion. And please remember that 667 figure. You'll see why shortly. You'll see why. So that's basically what it does. It aggregates all the information and makes it available free of charge, unless people want to kind of buy the whole database. Of course, that's different. But for ordinary folk, it's free of charge as a public good. I could not believe that I was able to access this treasure chest of corporate infringement data without even paying a penny, without having to pay anything towards it at all. That was amazing. And what really got me excited, and I ended up spending most of the weekend playing with the data, just looking around. What really got me excited was when I clicked on the button about the order of penalties by industry. So these are the different types of violations. And if I go back one step, here, if we go to industry totals, I could not believe what I was seeing. I could not believe what I was seeing. It was so clear, so specific, so accurate. So what you've got here, ladies and gentlemen, is a listing by industry type, according to how bad they've been in terms of infringements recorded by courts and federal bodies, etc. Financial services was the top. And given that my organization is dedicated to reforming the way financial services works, isn't it useful to me to have this data at my fingertips? Look at the amount though, $331 billion, not million, $1 billion worth of infringements. And I said a few moments ago to remember the figure 667 billion. I'm not particularly good at maths, but even I can realize that what that actually means is that the financial services sector is responsible for about half the infringements against US entities. In other words, if you add up pharmaceuticals and oil and gas and motor vehicles and utilities and healthcare and telecoms and IT and et cetera, all the way to the very, very bottom, you end up with the same amount. In other words, financial services is responsible for roughly half of it. And what the database did that just blew me away, you click on financial services, you get the top 10 parent companies, and Phil Materia later on will explain the significance of the phrase parent companies, because there are some very, very powerful, unique features within this database that make it very, very special. So Phil, if you're not already planning to, please do make a point of covering off the parent subsidiary matching function. And then it gives you a case-by-case listing, starting with the worst offenders. And this is in the financial services sector. You can do this in many, many other sectors, as I'll show you in a moment. I think Violation Tracker is the easiest thing to enthusiastically promote that I've ever come anywhere near in my 57 years of living. It's just so self-evidently a really good public utility. This is a great piece of collateral for any kind of person that wants to do any kind of campaign or reform work. And it's absolutely awesome. If you click on an individual case, for example, let's pick one here, quite recent. Here we go. I'll go to Wells Fargo. Can you see this here? Wells Fargo Bank for banking violations in 2018. I click on this, and it immediately takes you to a narrative. Now, this information didn't just magically get there. You know, the people at Good Jobs First who make Violation Tracker, they've got the information into it, and you'll be hearing more about that later. So you get a complete narrative, everything you need to know. $575 million worth of fine in 2018 for financial offences, breaching consumer protection issues. Here's the narrative, explaining exactly what was done, lots of other detail here, and very, very powerfully, and this is what makes the database so wonderfully credible, is you click on the link I just clicked onto, and so long as you've got a computer that's not on its last legs, as mine seems to be, you get to a point where it basically shows what the originating source of information is. I may need to come back to that later. Hello, my laptop's come to life. Here it is. Rob Bonta, Attorney General, whoever that gentleman is. Attorney General Becerra, don't know if I've pronounced that right, forgive me if I haven't, recovers $148.7 million for California in settlement with Wells Fargo over deceiving consumers. Sounds like what I was talking about earlier. Wonderful. So there's no subjectivity, there's no opinion, this is fact, this is hard data. In a world where we're moving further and further away from the truth and the idea that knowledge is power, you know, we're in this world that, you know, opinions matter and all the rest of it. Here we've got hard, reliable data, the kind of data that many, many academics around the world are making very good use of, regulators are making good use of, etc., etc. This is an absolute treasure chest of a utility for anybody that wants to understand who's doing what in terms of breaking the laws. And it's so searchable. One of the things I really like doing in this is if you go to this bit here called offence groups, you can click on it and you can go to, for example, let's say you were let's say you were a campaign activist. Let's say you were worried about environmental pollution and you wanted to know who's been doing what in terms of environmental infringements. You could go here, click on environment related offences, and within what, 1, 2, 3 seconds on my very, very slow laptop, 3 seconds, on yours it'll probably be 1, you get to this wonderful data all about the environment related offences. Again, a ranking of the top 10. By the way, so embarrassed, a British company has been fined more by American authorities than any other company for environmental infringements. 205 records. BP, what are you up to? What on earth is going on there? And one of the things you'll find when you go through the list is what we call recidivism. I didn't know that word until a year ago when Greg and Phil taught me about that word. Recidivism is the habit, if you like, of organizations or individuals that get caught doing the same things over and over again, and they just carry on doing it. This leads to some big questions, ladies and gentlemen, such as, well, if the fine isn't making a difference to their conduct, then surely you've got to do something else. Maybe lock somebody up every now and then, even if it's just to create a deterrent. So quite genuine point. This database is helping us within the Transparency Task Force to argue that there are flaws in the regulatory framework, because if the purpose of our regulatory framework is to change conduct, improve conduct, make the world a better place, the data in violation tracker, generally speaking, speaks to the idea that we need to change the regulatory framework because it doesn't change conduct. We have this endemic recidivism. And that's why corporate governance specialists, conduct specialists around the world are making such enormous use for it. One further thing I'll show, I'm just showing you how we within the TTF have been using it. We've been running events about particular institutions, such as particular banks or particular organizations. We can click onto it, go to, for example, HSBC or Barclays, and even though they're British businesses, it will capture the information around what's happened about their track record in the United States of America, going back a full 20 years to the year 2000. There was only one thing wrong with Violation Tracker as far as I was concerned when I had the fortune of stumbling across it last year. And what was that? Well, I guess it's obvious. You know, we want it all around the world, and there isn't a Violation Tracker UK. Well, there is now, yeah? By the end of the year, there will be Violation Tracker in the United Kingdom. I'll put a link into the chat in a moment that talks to the press release that was issued, a press release that was picked up by Thomson Reuters Regulatory Office, which is quite an achievement, by the way. Again, I'm going to try and share my screen just to show you that. Yep, I think I can share screen. So here's the piece that was published by Thomson Reuters Regulatory Unit, Regulatory Intelligence Unit, telling the great news the Violation Tracker is coming to the UK. There's a wonderful bit of writing here, and I believe we have somebody from Thomson Reuters here with us tonight. We're very grateful for the coverage that that particular press release got. As you might be able to tell, I can talk about Violation Tracker for a long time, too long. What I will say is this: I could not possibly be any more enthusiastic about the fact that Violation Tracker exists and that Violation Tracker is coming to the UK. And the really good news is I'm not the only one that feels that way. So what I'm going to do now is again share my screen. Before I'm going to invite Peter Young to say a few words before we then go to Philip Matera. This is the body of people mostly based in the UK. I'll try to make it a bit bigger. Body of people mostly based in the UK who are part of the Violation Tracker community. Everybody that's listed here is part of the Violation Tracker community, and some people, the people where it says yes in the far right hand corner, these are individuals who are part of the Violation Tracker UK Advisory Board. And we had our second meeting just a couple of hours ago. It's a great team, you know, world-class people working together collaboratively on a voluntary basis because they believe in Violation Tracker as much as I do, as much as Phil does, as much as Greg Leroy does and his wonderful team in Washington, DC, that we've had the absolute, and I mean this, the absolute privilege of working with over the last year to help bring Violation Tracker to the UK. I'll be saying more a bit later on, but I think that's enough for now. I hope that kind of gets the ball rolling. I guess the simple answer to the question, you know, why are we bringing Violation Tracker to the UK? The really simple answer is because it's going to help make the UK a better place. It's going to publicise corporate infringements because of the bright light of transparency. It's going to change behaviour. You know, people do what they do in the dark because they believe they can get away with it. Well, there's no more darkness. With Violation Tracker around, if organisations break the rules, it will get publicised. We speak to that fantastic quote from 1914, the Justice Louis Brandeis quotation, which was, sunlight is the most powerful disinfectant. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And Violation Tracker, to my mind, is just one great big dose of sunlight, you know, and that's exactly what we want. We already know within the TTF world, within the Transparency Task Force world, that when we publicize what particular financial institutions have done using Violation Tracker, for example, the events we've run recently about RBS, the events we've got coming up shortly about HSBC, etc., we're able to publicize in a you can't argue with us manner to really drive home what the data is actually telling us. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to invite my colleague Alexandra to deal with a few housekeeping points for me. Alexandra is an amazing member of our team. We've run, I think, 34 events so far this year. Alexandra has been responsible for the success of every single one of them. And Alexandra, please do take a few moments to deal with some housekeeping points for me before we then go to Peter Young and then to Phil Matera. Alexandra, to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, and welcome everyone. Just to let you know, we are recording tonight's session and it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, TTF TV, in due course. It usually takes a few days for it to get up, and I'll send you an email once it's been uploaded. I'll also let you know to please use the chat as much as you want to introduce yourself, put your contact details in there, make any comments or ask any questions. I'll circulate the chat notes tomorrow in a follow-up email. And also, if you use Twitter, please do feel free to tweet during the event and do tag us. We'll retweet it, of course. I'll put our Twitter handle in the chat as well. So thank you very much and enjoy.
Thank you very much indeed, Alexandra. Just before I pass over to Mr. Peter Young, who we've got a tremendous admiration for. Peter is, I made this comment in our advisory group meeting earlier today. I think Peter's got to be one of the world's most connected people. It's absolutely fantastic to have somebody of Peter's kind of caliber supportive of this project. Just before I pass on to Peter, I'll simply say this. Please don't make the mistake that this is just an event. Yeah, we're not just running an event here. We are deliberately, proactively, systematically galvanizing support for something that's going to help make the world a better place. It's as simple as that. So you're here, please embrace what we're trying to do, please support what we're trying to do, because we really do believe that groups of people committed to a cause can make a difference. Those aren't just words, you know, we live and breathe this day after day after day, and we've got so much evidence to show. In fact, mankind, you know, the human race is littered with loads of evidence that proves that people focused on doing worthwhile things, working collaboratively together can make a difference. I really do believe in that. Mr. Peter Young, please do take the opportunity to share a few thoughts before we go to Phil in Washington, DC. Thank you, Peter.
Hello, thank you, Andy. Yeah, okay, I'll be brief. Thanks for the chance of jumping in a bit early. Yeah, people who don't know me, some of you do, my background's very much from the sustainability and the environment side, and I'm very much involved in sustainable finance, environmental finance. I chair the International Standards Committee on Sustainable Finance, a sort of quasi-regulator for the Green Investment Bank, and very much involved in a range of third sector activities. What I would say about Violation Tracker is it's a real gap filled that was really sorely needed. And having worn hats in government, in industry, in the third sector and in regulators, I can tell you that all of those sectors will really benefit from its existence. And although my experience, I say, is being directly in terms of actual litigation and infringement has been very much in the environmental side, and particularly, for example, in the waste industry, which was particularly bad, and knowing how hard that regulators work to bring people to justice in that, almost immediately they were able to Phoenix-like reappear, reoffend and re-damage both the environment and people. And that was because there was a very poor linkage and the ability for people to form new companies, to break all sorts of requirements that are put upon them to prevent them becoming company directors again. They just become serial offenders. This recidivism, as it's called, serial offenders is what I know it as. And what is so disappointing is how much reputational damage is done by a relatively small proportion of players in any sector by being permanent miscreants, permanent and deliberate breakers of the law. And yet there's been no way of actually picking that up. The second thing is I wanted to say is it's really good at showing how that operates across a range of different jurisdictions and activities. And one of the things that Violation Tracker does in the States and can do for us in the UK is to stop that slipperiness whereby, because different infringements come under different court systems, come under different regulators, that serial misbehavior doesn't come across at all. They're known as one-off. They get away with that view of, oh, this is a one-off, so maybe it's not so bad. But actually it's not a one-off, it's a multiple requirement, and many organizations that are in this dark cloud, if you like, operate deliberately to continually put across that myth, and it completely blows that out of the water. The other thing that I wanted to say is that the power of its access to everyone, the free to access, is so important, and that's what is unique about getting this funded, and why just to sort of amplify what Andy's just said, I think this is really important that everybody amplifies the knowledge that this is coming and spreads the word, because its value is actually everybody knowing it's there and getting its usage up. That will be really important when it's launched. And while we're in that process of getting it ready, it's building up that expectation is so powerful. And I know from my conversations with people who lead regulators, they can't get this kind of information at the moment. They don't have the resources to. The research required is phenomenal. And the experiences you'll hear from these guys in actually how to tackle that is amazing, because it's not something that's earned over a few days, months, even years. It's literally a sort of decade experience that you need to be able to deliver something as effective as this. And that's why I'm very, very enthusiastic, very keen to support it. Andy, I could go on a long time. I think I've been given a minute. I've probably overdone that already, but thank you for letting me in early to say those things, Andy.
Wonderful to have you with us, Peter. Thank you so much. Please let's show our appreciation for Peter for being here and for his enthusiasm for the project. It's really infectious. Peter, thank you very, very much indeed. We're going to go straight now to Phil Matera. Please, Phil, talk about your background, how it all started. Talk about the roles you've had in the past and the journey that you've been on, because in many, many ways, you have very much been the brains behind this whole initiative. And my goodness me, am I glad that you have done what you've done. Because of that, we're able to now bring Violation Tracker to the UK. Mr. Philip Matera, over to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Andy, for that very effusive overview of Violation Tracker. So I'm the research director of an NGO in Washington, D.C. called Good Jobs First. And we introduced, Good Jobs First is works on various issues involving corporate accountability. Its primary and historical interest has been on corporate accountability with regard to subsidies that companies receive from state and local governments. But I've also been involved in corporate accountability in a wider sense, involving lots of different issues. But perhaps our biggest claim to fame has been the creation of a series of databases in which we bring together large amounts of government information from many different sources. We kind of add value to it. We make it, highly searchable and available to the public. And Violation Tracker is one of the 4 databases we have. And it was originally introduced in 2015. But in a sense, the roots of the database go back decades. For me, it goes back actually to 1980, when I was a young researcher on the staff of Fortune magazine in New York, when I was assigned to gather information for an article about corporate criminality. And the editors of the magazine were under the assumption that there was actually very little corporate criminality. I don't know where they got that idea, but that was their working assumption. And they made the mistake of assigning me to do the research for this story, because I was highly motivated to disprove that hypothesis. And I think I did. I actually showed that even with a very narrow definition of criminality, and a limited universe of corporations, that there was a substantial track record of companies. You know, given that this had occurred not long after the Watergate scandal, which people may remember was not just a political scandal, but was also a business scandal, because it turned out, you know, what came out through that investigation was the fact that a lot of large corporations were making illegal campaign contributions, particularly to the Nixon re-election campaign. But anyway, the editors thought I wouldn't find very much. I found a lot. And for me, it sparked what turned out to be a kind of a lifelong interest in the idea of documenting corporate misconduct and criminality. I worked on various projects over the ensuing years that touched on this, but it was really only in 2015 when we had the opportunity at Good Jobs First to begin to approach this in a very systematic way and create a database that could bring together information from a wide range of sources. And you know, we now cover more than 300 different state and federal agencies, state, local, and federal agencies. And we continually expand the coverage of the database. So for example, I'm now in the process of collecting data from something called the Financial Industry Regulatory Association, or FINRA. Some of you may be familiar with. It's a little different from the other sources because it's technically an industry self-regulator, but because it's authorized by Congress, you know, it seemed like it was a legitimate agency to include, and its data is really an amazing example of the recidivism that Andy was talking about before. The big Wall Street firms just show up over and over again, paying penalties for all kinds of misconduct, many different ways in which they are basically cheating investors. And they just keep paying these penalties, and it's not clear that it changes their behavior at all. But anyway, we'll be adding that to the US violation tracker. It was suggested that I say a little bit about who uses the US database. And we actually have a very wide range of users. The ones that I'm most excited about are the campaigners who use it, the corporate accountability campaigners. And these include, for example, people from labor unions. The research director of one union told us recently that Violation Tracker is as important to his staff as the morning cup of coffee, because they just use it every day, when they're doing background research on the companies that they're confronting in their contract campaigns and their organizing campaigns. Environmental groups use it all the time. Greenpeace, for example, their researchers are very enthusiastic users. Shareholder activist groups are using it. There's a group called As You Sow here in the US that has used our data in a number of different reports. Public interest groups. There's a group here called Public Citizen that was founded by Ralph Nader that's very concerned about corporate conduct and about regulation. We've actually collaborated with them on a number of reports. But it's also used by journalists all the time. Our data gets cited both in large publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, also many smaller publications. It's used by public officials for purposes such as vetting companies when they make procurement decisions. It's used by many different academics doing analyses of the data. And it's actually, finally, it's used by corporations themselves, either to monitor their own profile, how they stand in relation to their competitors. And it's also used by them for practical purposes such as due diligence, if they're considering a merger or an acquisition, to see what kind of liability they might be taking on with another company. We also license the full data set to a number of investment advisory and risk management groups. We would like to expand our licensing activity because it's one of the ways we bring in some of the revenue to support what we're doing. So that's so as you can see, it's used by many different people. It's got a great deal of web traffic, so we know that it's filling a need in the U.S. and now we're hoping to fill a similar need in the UK. So we're now hard at work doing the same kind of data gathering from UK regulators. We started with a working list of about 50 different regulators. And in this effort, I'm working with Anish Raghunandan of the London School of Economics. I'm not sure if he's on the call yet. Yes, he is. There he is. Hi, Anish. He's our consultant on the project. And we have a couple of freelance researchers, Anthony K. Bagley and Alex Varley-Winter, who are helping with the research effort. And we're gathering data in a number of different ways. Some of it is by scraping data from official websites when the data is in a format that allows for that. In other cases, we're manually extracting data from documents that are posted on agency websites, for example, press releases. We've also got about a dozen Freedom of Information requests that we've submitted to agencies, particularly some of the larger agencies where the scraping and the manual techniques would be difficult. And we're hoping those requests are fulfilled in a timely fashion. Because we would really like to be as complete as possible when we introduce the first version of the database, which we hope to happen in October. Andy asked me to say something about the parent subsidiary matching system. And what we do in the US is that we take the entities that are named in the individual records, and we try to link them to their ultimate corporate parents, because usually the government records don't tell you that information. They're giving you the name of a unit or a division or a subsidiary of a larger company, but you wouldn't know it often from looking at the name of that entity that they're part of a larger corporation. So we make those linkages, and then on the database you can see those totals by parent company. And we do that for a list of more than 3,000 parents. And it took a lot of work to put together that system. We're trying to reproduce that for the UK. Anish and I are working on this, trying to figure out how to use the data from Companies House to provide those linkages. And we're now thinking that we will start with a universe that'll consist at least of the Financial Times 350 plus the Sunday Times, I think it's called the Top Track 100 largest privately held firms. So we'll have a list of about 500 corporations for which we will aggregate the data that we find in all of the individual entries. So that's pretty much what we're up to. We also have an IT consultant who's actually now at work building the UK site, which will resemble the US site in many ways, but will also have some differences. One significant difference is that the UK site will include cases without a monetary penalty. In the US, we only include cases with dollar penalties, in part because that's an almost universal feature of regulatory violations in the US. We found in the UK, there's a lot more use of cautions, things of that sort, where first-time offenders are not penalized. We wanted to capture those as well. So we're making adjustments in the search page so that people will be able to show those penalties or those infringements that do not have a monetary penalty attached. So that's what we're all about. I hope you'll be happy with the outcome of this effort, and we hope that it'll have an even bigger impact in the UK than we've had in the US. Thank you.
Phil, thank you very much indeed. Excellent. We're bang on schedule timing wise, which makes a really nice change for us. We're often behind schedule, but right now we're spot on, which is great, which means we do have some time for some comments and questions. So please just wave a hand at me, either literally or digitally, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment at this stage. We're going to go straight to Dr. Roger Miles. Roger, lovely to have you with us. Roger, please do tell everybody a bit about yourself. Roger's been involved with the TTF for several years. He's one of our very, very important ambassadors. Roger, please introduce yourself and then make your point. Thank you.
Andy, thank you very much. And I don't know if I am the Reuters representative that you referred to, or if there is somebody else here, but I've been a contributing editor at Reuters Regulatory Intelligence for about 10 years now. Fantastic presentation, Phil. Thank you, and others for sort of characterizing what's going on. I think this is fabulous, and I particularly like this idea of picking up recidivism, if I can say the word, recidivism, repeat offending. I wonder, and I'm very interested about your comments, Phil, about the different nature of UK regulation and the lighter touch. Peter, sorry, credit to you. Thank you for the Code Foundation. The PRA watch list, I don't know if that means anything to you. Is that the kind of thing that you'd be able to pick up on? And can I also ask another question just about beneficial ownership? So would you, and indeed did you, pick up on the connection between, for example, the Sackler family and the Purdue Pharmaceutical Company? Can I leave those with you as something?
Thank you.
Yeah, well, the first thing I would mention is that all of our entries in both the US and the UK trackers will only cover cases involving corporations, not individuals. So it just was impractical to cover the cases with individuals. I mean, so in the case of the Sacklers, we do have entries in the US database for Purdue Pharma, and they've paid billions. They probably will end up paying more. There's still cases that haven't been resolved against them. So we'll document all of that.
Sorry, Phil, can I just quickly chime in there? Because I think one thing I also want to just add to that is because we provide these linkages, right? Because you provide the parent company, it's then like quite simple, and for somebody with the access to the appropriate financial databases to map that on up to the controlling block holders, right? Which would then give you the Sackler family, right? So we don't necessarily have the data, nor do we sort of have the nor is I guess there a space on the website to list all the controlling block holders and develop the linkages. But by providing the parent company, there are a number of data providers that will then link you these, fact sets for one, right? That will then link you up. You can easily link the block holders, so the Sacklers, right, and Purdue Pharma. So, but without, I guess, providing the link between Purdue Pharma and its subsidiaries, all of that wouldn't matter. So I just wanted to sort of chime in.
It's really what I was looking at. Thank you, Anish. I'm thinking about what British law, I think, referred to at one point as the guiding mind. The idea that you have a sort of super holder of interest who is ultimately responsible for the kind of decision-making and the corporate culture that goes on.
Thank you, Roger. Roger, let me get you back. So take yourself off mute, because you've done everything other than explain who you are and what you do. So a little bit of intro, because I want everyone to know that people of your caliber are excited about this as well. Please do give a bit of your background.
Well, that's very kind of you, Andy. Thank you. As it happens, this is quite an auspicious week for me, because next week I'm publishing a book called Culture Audit in Financial Services, which is the culmination of my talking to conduct regulators in 8 jurisdictions all around the world. So not just the UK, but Holland, Singapore, Australia, the US, and so on. So conduct regulation, which as most of you on this call, I'm sure will know, is the checking of behavior, not just behavior towards customers and clients, but behavior between and within teams in financial services, where there is evidence of abusive patterns of behavior. And as a psychologist, that's something I'm particularly interested in. Of course, how corporate culture breaks down when abusive behavior becomes normalized, whether it's setting unrealistic targets or sales teams forming little private clubs and going off and doing bad things. So I'm deeply interested in the sort of cause and effect of that. I also, again, full disclosure, Andy, fair enough for asking, I also run on behalf of the banking industry a thing called the UK Finance Conduct and Culture Academy, which, although it sounds very grand, is actually just a group of us who are sort of straddling between academia and practitioner worlds. And we gather together the best resources for research and show them to practitioners. I'm very happy to say, by the way, I've been heavily trailing Violation Tracker for about a year on that platform. It's one of sort of 3 or 4 examples of best practice in increasing transparency and accountability in financial services, and I'm very happy to talk it up. Very pleased with that. By the way, also Phil, lest I have to leave this call without saying this, I have a number of people on the, let's call it the reg tech side, so people who are developing assessment tools and culture audit tools, who I'd be very happy to put you in touch with after this call. And is that enough? That's probably more than enough from me.
That's absolutely awesome. Thank you very much indeed, Roger. Super stuff. So if, Alexander, can you pick up an action to connect Roger and Phil by email so they can have that conversation? Roger, that'd be very helpful indeed. Roger's one of about 300 or so ambassadors for the TTF around the world. We're very, very proud of that. You know, we let me put it this way, we punch above our weight, let's put it that way. And we're great, you know, really, really pleased to have the blessing, so to speak, of people like Roger Miles and others around the world. Let's go to Brian Basham, who's one of our speakers later. Really pleased to have Brian with us. Brian wanted to make a point, so Brian, now's your chance. Thank you so much.
It's a great privilege to meet you. You've done amazing work. I was an investigator myself with the Times and Telegraph, and I helped set up the Centre. I was one of the 3 founders of the Centre for Investigative Journalism. But my investigation has mainly been involved in M&A, working for companies against other companies. So I've investigated Tiny Rowlands, Richard Branson, etc., and Maxwell, Hanson, people like that. So, but your statistical analysis is immensely valuable and leads to the potential for action. The thing is, my question is, how do we promote that action, and how do we get people to reform? I believe that from my experience of advising companies over the years, which I did, my belief is that the only thing that works, absolutely the only thing that works, is personal jeopardy. You know, that individuals need to be taken to task for their involvement in corporate crimes, because the violations that you so painstakingly track, which are so immensely useful and eye-opening. I mean, when you think that Bank of America is more transgressive than the whole of the oil and gas sector, I mean, it's just mind-bending, nearly twice as much. But what do we do about it? And my experience of advising major corporations, British Airways, Wimpy, all of these other big companies, is that they don't care very much. The shareholders pay. Occasionally, employees get sacked because they need to make savings. But the people who are earning vast sums of money sit there untouched. And I wonder whether it is possible to show up the shareholders in these companies, because they're not doing anything. Major, huge fund management companies are doing very little in this, and they have the power to create change. So whether you can show up the shareholders, whether you can show up BlackRock, they'll appear in everything because they're so big. But whether we can point to individuals who can be named and shamed.
Wonderful. such great insights and ideas. Brian, there's a particular point that I'd like to make following on from exactly what you've just said. I'm going to share my screen again. So we've got an event in a few weeks' time, I think it is, all about HSBC. We're basically, for various reasons, shining a bright light on HSBC. So here's the data that you get in Violation Tracker. Remember, this is the US version. So all the data you're seeing is about infringements against the US authorities. So HSBC, $6.5 billion worth of fines. All these abuses, financial offences, competition-related offences, employment-related offences, consumer protection-related offences, government contracting-related offences, etc., etc. Top 5 offence types: toxic security abuses. Then if you scroll down the list, you get that never-ending list of fines. So isn't this wonderful ammunition, for example, at an AGM or anywhere else, to say to HSBC and the regulators of HSBC, come on, look at the data. You know, this is not time for cognitive dissonance. We can't ignore what the information is telling us. The information is telling us that you need more personal accountability. I remember Brian telling me some months ago how the construction industry, in fact, Brian, let me make you this point. Sorry, let you make this point. Tell everybody about what happened in the construction industry when those new...
I'll tell you about HSBC first, because Stephen Green, who I used to know, now Lord Green, is a vicar. And he was on watch when most of these transgressions took place, or at least originated. And unbelievably, he became an advisor to Tony Blair. Now, on the face of it, he's a very good man. But, you know, until he's named and shamed, until he's made to face up to what he allowed, the directors that follow him won't do anything about it. The story that Andy's talking about is that I used to advise on a chap called Cliff Chetwood, who was chairman of Wimpy. And a long time ago, I think it was 1987, the Herald of Free Enterprise sailed out of Zeebrugge and sank. And not connected with construction at all, of course. But the finding, the judge found that the deckhand who had left the bow doors open was not responsible, but that the corporation was, and sort of invented the idea of corporate responsibility for this matter. I got a panic call from Cliff, who asked me to go over to see him, and I shot over to Sir Cliff, who was a friend as well as a client. And he was in a panic because his lawyers, Clifford Turner, I think at the time, had warned the board that they could be held up for corporate manslaughter. And they're in the most terrible funk about it. I don't think corporate manslaughter was ever brought as a charge. I'm not sure about that. But certainly just the mere threat of it caused them to take action. And I said to Andy, if I'd been a commercial person, which I'm really not, I pretend to be, but I'm not really, I'd have gone out and bought shares in a yellow jacket firm, because within, and I'm not exaggerating, 6 months, building sites were a sea of yellow jackets, hard hats, steel toe cap boots, gloves, and all the defensive mechanism, because they were they were conscious of the failure to prevent. Now there's a very good man called John Sharkey, who used to be an advertising man, but he's now a Lord Sharkey. And about 4 or 5 years ago, he tried to squeeze into the finance bill legislation relating to failure to prevent in the banking sector. And he almost did it. He got 198 votes to 200. And the reason he failed, amusingly and typically, was because Paddy Ashdown had a dinner date. But, that's what we need. We need failure to prevent. We need personal jeopardy. And I personally don't think we'll make any advance until we have personal jeopardy.
Thank you very much, Brian. And the data that we've got in Violation Tracker is exactly the kind of data that we can use to show in a very evidence-based way why there needs to be change, why there needs to be reform.
Yeah,
So
that's
it all links together so beautifully. We're going to go to Phil for any sort of final comments from Phil before we go to our next speaker, Stuart Woolard. Stuart, forgive me, Phil, any final comments from you before we move on?
No, let's.
Okay, all right, we're good. In which case, can we please take an opportunity to show our appreciation to Phil, not just for his session just now, but for everything he's done over the last 40 years, shining a big bright light on corporate infringements. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So our next speaker is Stuart Woolard, and Stuart's been a very active and very supportive member of the Transparency Task Force for several years. He's one of our ambassadors. We really do rate the work that Stuart does and have done for a long time. He focuses on all sorts of things that really do matter a great deal. His work and his scope of his work is extremely relevant to what the Transparency Task Force is all about and what Violation Tracker is all about. Stuart is the managing partner of Organizational Maturity Services LLP, and he's also the co-founder and council member at the Maturity Institute. Stuart co-created the OM-Index, which you'll be touching on and speaking about, and he leads the frankly pioneering work within the investment community to integrate intangibles, in other words, corporate culture, governance, human capital, management systems into real live day-to-day investment decision-making, engagement and stewardship activities. Stuart, really pleased that you're taking the time to be with us this evening. Please do pick up from there and tell us all about your thoughts around Violation Tracker and how you've been able to make good use of it. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Stuart.
And so yes, I'm going to talk about our organizational maturity ratings and what we call our OM-Index, or Organizational Maturity Index, and how we use Violation Tracker to help us produce a rating, which at the top of this slide says we're rating the extent to which companies create material value and risk from human intangible factors arising from all their stakeholders, so workforce, suppliers, customers, wider local communities, and indeed regulators and investors are stakeholders too. The rating was conceived in 2014. We worked with a Standard & Poor's affiliate company during 2014, and we launched the initial ratings in 2015, the same time that Violation Tracker actually got off the ground as well. So that's quite a nice coincidence. And as you can see, it was designed specifically to sit alongside a credit rating. The S&P affiliate company we work with said, you know, how we rate companies through a financial lens is not good enough. We need to look at the health of organizations in, frankly, human terms, because it's the human beings which create the value, but it's also the human beings which create the risk. Can we do something about it? So that's what OM-Index is essentially, and you can see there's a AAA type scale which mirrors the Standard & Poor's credit rating scale. We use 32 questions or diagnostic factors which are grouped into 10 core indicators. The indicators are on the right hand side of the slide. As you'll see, we talked about look at corporate purpose, human governance, strategic clarity, innovation and improvement, human capital risk, culture, a number of different things. We also use the ratings to form the basis of what we call total stakeholder value, because what we're trying to capture is value and risk which arises from all a company's stakeholders. And when we integrate some financial metrics, and what we typically use is price to book ratio for listed firms, we fuse together a more total form of value, or total, what we call total stakeholder value, which is a sense a company's impact across all its stakeholders, including shareholders. So that's what OM-Index sets out to do. If I can just move it on. Very quickly, these are the 32 questions, as you see at the top, from corporate purpose, value, coherence between market and human values, governance, trust, all the way down to stakeholders, decision-making, environment, authenticity at the bottom. The important thing here is that each individual factor score is generated using analyst diagnostic guidance, and which that details how we interpret the evidence and judge how to score each of these factors, because we're looking at creating a quantitative outcome. And as the reason I'm speaking today is one of the important sources of evidence that we use is Violation Tracker. Here's a slide on some examples. So these aren't written by me, they're actually written by a number of equity analysts that we've trained. We've trained fund management teams and we've trained equity analysts. This is a group of equity analysts we trained last year, and I just thought it was interesting just to go through some of the reports that they produced to see how Violation Tracker was being used. So the top one, it might be a little bit difficult to see the slide, but it looks into Philips, Dutch headquartered company, looks at their relationship between the US government and concludes that they've eroded some trust with the US government, and that's a bad thing. So it's caused a markdown of their OMINDEX score. But on the right hand side, it's interesting because Violation Tracker has been used to support the idea, or the thing that the company puts forward is that their new supply chain procurement program is actually serving a purpose and doing good things. And here Violation Tracker has shown a drop off in some of the violations around its supply chain, which supports what the company is saying. So we can distill what the authenticity about companies, issues of trust, whether what it says about values and principles stands up to close scrutiny, and these are all important factors. The middle piece, if you look at the middle of the slide, there's a bit on Novartis, talking about multiple false marketing settlements that Novartis has been found to have. Interestingly, it says, we note that the number and value are generally in line with large pharmaceutical peers, which obviously says something about the pharmaceutical industry and not something particularly good. Obviously, the Sackler family and Purdue were raised a bit earlier, which fall into that category. And at the bottom, there's another discussion around environmental charges and claims around that particular company being a responsible manufacturer. So we can pull out from Violation Tracker a number of different things which tell us things around the company, attesting what it's saying about itself, particularly these days when companies are putting forward that their purpose, there's a lot of pressure on companies to show that they have a purpose which is societal, that they've got good values and principles, that they're authentic, that they seek to cooperate with all their stakeholders. These are all things which companies are under a huge amount of pressure to tell the outside world that they're about. Violation Tracker is fantastic because it can pick these things apart and it can give us some really good evidence to test these in practice and to get under the skin of the organization, if you like. I wanted to focus on one particular case study, which is in a little bit more depth, which I think talks to some of the comments that have been made a little bit earlier, which is this idea of recidivism and serial misconduct. We released our first set of OMINDEX ratings in 2015. We did cover a few banks at the time. In 2016, we wrote a report on Barclays, and we sent that to a number of investment houses. And in fact, we sent one to one investment house that actually issued a credit note saying that Barclays culture had improved and therefore its credit outlook was therefore better. And we said we fundamentally disagreed with that, and we wanted to show what the evidence said around that. The interesting thing about Barclays was that when we looked at Barclays in 2016, Jes Staley had just taken the helm, and it meant that we wanted to look at where Jes Staley had come from. And when we looked at JP Morgan and we looked at Violation Tracker, it was a huge corporate rap sheet. And I use the term because that's what Violation Tracker puts out. There's a lot of corporate rap sheets on a lot of organizations, and JP Morgan's was particularly long. What really caught my eye, I remember this specifically at the time, was JP Morgan had a history of firing whistleblowers. And I've just highlighted a couple of the one that hit the press, but it had a history of firing lots of different whistleblowers, which was a big red flag. What does that say about an organization when it's suppressing employees' voice, when it's sending a message to its staff that if you raise your head above the parapet, you're going to get it chopped off? And one of the things that we said about Staley was coming from JP Morgan, that must include learned behavior. And if he's learned to ignore, endorse, or lack awareness around ethics and illegal behavior, we could assume that that may happen again. Obviously, this is when the whistleblower issue came out in 2017, and we wrote a bigger report on the banks in 2017, and this certainly supported that view. The thing about the whistleblower, you know, lots of people on this call will absolutely, you know, understand the importance of whistleblowers and protecting whistleblowers and seeing how critical they are to the health of organizations and to the health of local communities and customers and wider society. It was interesting when I put these slides together, we'd made a specific point that firing whistleblowers is damaging to, it was damaging to JP Morgan, certainly damaging to Barclays. You know, what signals does that send? And Barclays saw a drop off in about 30% of whistleblower activity in the year that after the Staley incident. But more important, you know, even more importantly, perhaps is, you know, what does it say about raising your hand about issues that are going on in your organization? Not necessarily unethical or illegal behavior, but more importantly, when you're making any critical, constructive comment, it's a huge contraindicator and a big value eroder, as well as a big signal for risk. So I think the point here is that what we're trying to do with OMINDEX is look at the organization in terms of its health currently, but the extent to which we can use it as a lead indicator. So can we see it predicting future behavior and future actions? And we've talked about that already in this session. You know, when we start seeing serial misconduct by organizations and we see that pattern, then it helps us to predict that this is likely to happen in the future. And that it can't be good for the organization, it can't be good for wider stakeholders. And we're seeing it time and time again. And I think that's one of the most important things. I just wanted to sort of reflect, just share this last slide with you. You know, do our ratings stand up? Do they matter? The University of Cambridge did a study on a lot of our data, and is in fact using a much bigger data set, that found some interesting relationships between a number of the individual factors that we test within OMINDEX, but also the overall ratings themselves. You'll see here on these slides, there are a number of kind of what I would call ESG issues, but very simply what this data analysis is showing is that higher rated firms are less associated with violations of national legislation, supply chain issues, violation of international standards, controversial products and services, also incidences of fraud, corruption, bribery, all the things that we've been talking about so far. So this stuff really does matter, and it really does tell us something incredibly important. And I think just finishing up, in a world of ESG where we're trying to find good ESG data, finding good metrics that tell us something, that do link us very, very clearly between an organization and material value and risk outcomes. I think this tells us, you know, what Phil and Greg and Andy and Brian and everybody else has said. This is really, really important. It's hard data. And the more we get to grips, the more we interrogate it, the more we can use it in practice. And so I just simply say we found it extremely powerful and useful, certainly within the investment community. Everybody that we've trained in our methodology sees it of hugely significant importance. The other thing to say is our ratings are shared with companies, and we're now having lots of discussions with investor relations heads, for example, about their OMINDEX ratings, about the narrative of what Violation Tracker is telling us about their own organization. So, you know, all this pressure is good. And coming back to Phil's original motivation for doing this, how can we change corporate behavior, and how can we create business as a force for good? Because at the moment there's too much of it that's still a force for bad. I'll finish there, Andy.
Stuart, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. You've covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. Let's go to questions. Initially, if I can ask us to do this in an organized way, can we first of all have any questions or comments relating to what Stuart has just been talking about, and then we'll open the conversation up. So I'm going to go to gallery view so I can see everybody's hands. Forgive me if I missed you earlier if you were looking to ask a question. So would anybody like to make a comment or ask a question or make a comment? following Stuart's session before we go to the broader topic. Mr. Thomas Draper, please introduce yourself, sir, and share with us your thought. Thank you.
My name's Thomas Draper, and I'm in fact a PhD student, and I'm developing a mathematical model in order to try and reduce regulatory arbitrage. I did chat about it earlier on based on the work of Newman and Morgenstein. And violation tracker, I would agree with the last speaker, is a good thing in that it does allow us to see not only the amount of this there is, but the differing penalties in differing jurisdictions. Because one of the major problems we face in any kind of penalty, I believe, as Brian was saying earlier on, is not just individual accountability, but it's actually standardization of penalties in different jurisdictions. Now that finance, and I'm dealing with violation tracker from finance point of view, is so international. And I'll give you an example of how there are still some perhaps things to look to in violation tracker. If you look at financial infractions in the United States, you can find many different ones, but if you try and get through to actually a capital reserve infraction, it's actually very obscure what a contravention of regulation for the capital reserve actually is. Not only that, but when you look through to right through to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currencies penalty, we often get that it was a cease and desist order and a $0 penalty. Okay, so obviously the actual, in another jurisdiction, it would be higher. Although I've looked through violation tracker a lot and I find it absolutely great, fantastic resource. In terms of penalty coordination, it's actually the amount of penalty in each jurisdiction, which is something which could be highlighted, I think. Sorry if my point is not absolutely on what the previous speaker said. I do understand about whistleblowing. In fact, it will work on, in fact, Newman and Morgenstein will work on anything where the players are rational and an illicit profit can be obtained at differing risks of being caught.
Thomas, I found that really interesting. I've never ever thought about that. So the ability to kind of say, take an international view around the different levels, the uneven landscape, the arbitrage between different regulatory regimes. Wow, that's a powerful idea. I really like that, Thomas. Stuart, any comments on that, please, Stuart?
Yeah, I think Thomas made an interesting point. I mean, I think one of the things that we've found, particularly in our work, is it's interesting when you talk to investors, because they're not interested unless they're going to get fined a lot of money and it becomes a material financial issue. Increasingly, organizations often are getting litigated in London where possible, because generally that's probably where they're going to get hit harder than if they get, litigate in local jurisdictions. One of the things that we pick up on, and I'll give an example, GSK is a good example. We picked up on bribery within GSK, and where we initially found it happening in China. One of our issues is that, and it was said earlier, often companies, when a failure happens or a scandal emerges, generally there's some kind of denial. The centre says, well, here at headquarters, that's not who we are. It's not about, they're not our values, they're not our purpose. But it's a red flag for us, because if it's happening in one part of the organisation, there's a chance that this is a systemic problem. There's a probability there's a cultural issue, and that it's likely to happen somewhere else. And that was certainly true for GSK, and it's certainly true for the organisations we're finding in violation tracker. So picking up issues in different jurisdictions, but also the nature of the issue itself. I mentioned whistleblowing as a very good example. There might be small fines, but they're very, very significant issues in terms of what it tells you about the organization, what it tells you about communication or cooperation and trust and engagement. And these are all positive traits in a cultural sense, in where they don't happen well, or there's a toxic culture, they don't happen at all. And that's an organization that's carrying significant risks. So that would be my reflection on what Thomas was saying.
Thank you very much indeed, Stuart. I'm going to go to gallery view so I can see people with their hands up, which I didn't do earlier. My apologies for that. Mr. Nigel Cairns, lovely to see you with us tonight. Nigel, please introduce us and make your point. Thank you.
Okay, Nigel Cairns. I've been having an ongoing banking dispute for the last 14 years. But my question tonight is a general question about Violation Tracker. Will it be covering settlements at the adjudicator stage, possibly? I know that the Ombudsman publish settlements or decisions after an ombudsman has dealt with the matter. But I think the vast majority of cases are settled at the adjudicator stage, and I don't think any information whatsoever is made public about these.
Really interesting question. That's not one for me, that's one for Phil and possibly Anish. Phil, your thoughts on that particular point, please?
Well, we are looking at the data from the Financial Ombudsman, the Pensions Ombudsman, and the Employment Tribunal, which all may fall into that general category. There are cases, there are decisions that are posted on the websites of those agencies. There are some challenges in capturing the information. For example, for the Financial Ombudsman, there are more than 70,000 cases that were upheld, either partially withheld or upheld overall. And it would be difficult to capture all 70,000 of them from the format in which they're posted. Andy sent a message for us to someone at the agency to see whether we could get that information in a spreadsheet form to make it a lot easier for us to process, and we're not sure yet.
If I could just say, I don't know if it's going to be possible to get any information. My understanding is that the Ombudsman wash their hands of the matter when they've made the decision, and they leave any settlement between the agreement between the two bodies that have been in dispute. So I don't know that the Ombudsman actually ever know what those figures are.
One of the ideas that's crossed my mind is, as soon as Violation Tracker is up and running in the UK, would be to ask Phil or the guys at Good Jobs First or somebody somewhere to do a research paper. You know, which organisations has it been a piece of cake to get the data we need from? Which organisations has it been okay but not particularly easy? And which organisations are not providing easy, publicly accessible information that society wants? And that would be a basis of a really useful piece of research. And my hunch is that that kind of exposure, that kind of narrative will accelerate the rate at which we get all the data out there. You know, knowledge is power, and it's wrong that information that is publicly useful is not easily made available. That would be my take on that particular point. Let me go back to Phil to see if he has anything else to add to that, and then we'll go to the next person that would like to make a comment. Phil, anything else on that?
Well, you know, we haven't done an exhaustive look at these cases, but my impression was that there's some information available on these decisions that are posted on the website, and if there's an easy way to capture that and incorporate it into Violation Tracker UK, we'll do that.
Fantastic. I'm going to share my screen once again just before we go to our next speaker, because what I can show you is the list of organisations that Phil and his colleagues have put together. So these are the agencies from which infringement data will be collected, and it's a very long list. I genuinely was not expecting anything like a list as long as this in the very first iteration of Violation Tracker. And my hunch, I don't know this for certain, and maybe Phil would like to make a comment, it may well be that Violation Tracker, after just say 12 months of being up and running in the UK, might be further advanced than it was in the US. And any comment on that, Phil?
Well, first I should caution that for a few of these agencies, it turned out there's no available case information. So the final list will be a little bit smaller. In general, the number of cases handled by these agencies are smaller than the comparable agencies in the US. I mean, in part, that's because of the relative sizes of the two countries, the relative population. So I guess it's not surprising that there would be a difference that way. I mean, the difference in the approach we're taking here and from what we did in the US is that we started with a very limited list of agencies back in 2015. Mainly the Environmental Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Here, because of the enormous level of enthusiasm, we're trying to be as comprehensive as possible right off, right from the beginning. And if we can, we'll include data from all these agencies. There may be cases like the Financial Ombudsman data where it might not be practical to include that in the first version, but if the data is available, we'll capture it at some point.
Thank you very much indeed, Phil. And Nigel, thank you for your question. Mr. Paul Rogers, I think we're going to do the Paul Rogers, then to Gareth Tancred. Great to see you, Gareth, but first to Paul Rogers. Paul, thank you.
Yes, I'm involved with the Network for Social Change. I'd like to ask a very general question. This is not my field of specialism myself, so I'm coming as an outsider. It may be to Andy or Phil or possibly Nish. Given that, I guess, the British economy is maybe 1/8 of the size of the US economy. It's probably something like that. What is your feel about whether the level of, if you like, financial impropriety is like in Britain compared with the United States? I mean, it was a very impressive list you went through earlier on about all the different examples in the United States. Is Britain in a broadly similar state? Does it tend to crack down more or less in the United States? I just want to get the feel of it, if that can be done at all at this stage.
What a great question. Would anybody like to comment on that? Be that somebody from within the Violation Tracker team or elsewhere? Mr. Brian Basham,
well, I could say something about that. So we've collected data so far from about 30 different agencies. So, for example, in the financial area, we've for the Financial Conduct Authority and also the Financial Services Authority, because we're going back to 2010, we've got only about 200 cases that we were able to find. For the Prudential Regulation Authority, there only about a dozen cases. I was actually pretty surprised at the small number there. And so in general, if you just go by the number of cases, they're much smaller in the US. And also we're not seeing the enormous settlements of the kind that we had in the US after the financial crisis, where there were these multi-billion-dollar settlements. Now, I don't think this means that the UK, banks are behaving better. I think it's just, it may be that the regulatory system is not focused as much on bringing these kind of landmark cases against companies. Another issue has to do with class action lawsuits or private litigation. A number of the cases that we have in the US Violation Tracker are in that category. Class action lawsuits, from what I can tell, don't really exist in the UK. There are some kinds of private litigation where maybe that involve multiple plaintiffs, but these large cases involving thousands of plaintiffs don't seem to exist yet. I think there have been some attempts to move in that direction. So there just may be structural issues about the regulatory system, about the court system, et cetera, which will mean that the numbers that we end up with in terms of the number of cases and the total financial penalties will not be quite as eye-popping in the UK as they have been for the US.
Thank you very much indeed, Phil. What a great question and a very good response. As it happens, at about 12 o'clock today, we were having a conversation within TTF about the huge difference around the world in terms of access to justice. One of our ambassadors, Paul Bates, is a Canadian, but he is a barrister. He's also licensed in the UK. And he was telling us about how difficult it is for group type or class type action to take place in the UK, and therefore how risky and expensive it is for individuals to prosecute infringements by corporates. So we're going to do an event later in the year just to do a compare contrast between UK, Canada, US. We think it's going to be quite revealing. We're going to go to Bob Compton next, actually, and then we're going to go to Gareth Tancred. So Bob, I think you've raised your hand. Fire away, please, Bob. Thank you.
Yep. Hi, Andy. Just answering Phil's question about class actions. In the UK, it's only probably about 3 or 4 years ago that the law changed to allow class actions to happen. So it's still very much early days. We're probably about 20 years behind where the US is on class actions. So watch this space, I suspect.
Thanks, Bob. And as you've spoken, please now introduce yourself after the event, as it were. Bob's a very established ambassador within the TTF. He's been instrumental in a number of areas over the last 4 or 5 years, maybe. Bob, please tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your background. Thank you.
Okay, my background is pensions, setting up pension schemes, occupational pension schemes, trust space. In the last 15 years or so, I've been involved in creating a governance platform for trustees and companies to manage their occupational pension schemes by raising standards and making sure things are actually operating to the best possible standards that you could achieve. And obviously, from Andy's perspective, given a lot of support to the TTF over the last 3 or 4 years. So it's a quick one. Cheers, Andy.
Thank you very much, Bob. We're going to go to Gareth Tancred, who I'm very pleased to have with us this evening. And then we're going to go back to Brian Basham, because I know Brian got his calculator out at one point and did some maths around the violations from one of the banks, if I remember rightly. Brian, we'll get to you in a moment. Gareth, please do introduce yourself. And as I say, I'm very pleased to have you with us.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you for the invitation to be here. My name is Gareth Tancred. I'm the Chief Executive of the Pensions Management Institute. Our role is that we're the professional body for pensions professionals in the UK. Like any professional body, we uphold the standards for the sector. We typically do that through qualifications, CPD, producing vast streams of insight, and I could go on and on and on, but I'll leave it there for now. My question, it is more of a general question. It's probably directed to Phil. And I don't wish to sound like a conspiracy theorist when I ask this question, but whilst a great deal of this data may be available publicly, bringing it together into one place makes it incredibly powerful, particularly when it's consolidated and the data against one particular organization from many, many different sources can make that organization seem terrible, for want of a better word. My question is, therefore, have you come under any pressure to scrap it, to fold it, or any other different types of pressure, just to, I don't know, without wishing to sound like a conspiracy theorist, go away?
What a great point, Gareth. Thank you for making that point. Philip, what an interesting point to respond to. Have you experienced any pressure over the years as a consequence of the Power of Violation Tracker?
Well, actually, I wish we had received more pressure, because it would have suggested that these corporations, are feeling more threatened by this information. I have to confess that no, we haven't directly received any of that pressure. I guess the closest thing to that is that occasionally a company will, Greg likes to talk about a case where one bank contacted us and saying, why haven't you posted a violation by one of their competitors that just happened? And they wanted to make sure that their competitor looked as bad as possible on the website. So I guess it would be hard for them to argue this, because this is not information that we're gathering from, anonymous sources, or from deep throats within the corporate world. I mean, this is all data from open, official websites. So they can't really argue with the information. I mean, they may be unhappy about it, but they haven't found any way yet to effectively pressure us to cease and desist.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Gareth, I'm going to come back to you later, Gareth, to talk about how Violation Tracker's information could potentially be of some use to the pensions world in relation to ESG and governance and that kind of thing. But first of all, let's go to Brian. After Brian, we're going to go back to Stuart to give Stuart a chance to wrap up his session. Brian, to you first of all, please. Thank you.
I was interested in somebody, I've lost track who it was, I do apologise, saying that the UK is roughly 1/8 the size of the US, which indeed it is. But if you take that ratio, actually I took a 6, I think, and compared Lloyd's balance sheet to JP Morgan's balance sheet, which is the second most transgressive bank as far as I can recall on Violation Tracker. Dollar for dollar, Lloyd's is not quite up to Bank of America, but it's certainly more transgressive than JP Morgan, because it's been fined, I think, 20 billion over PPI, and there's a lot more in the pipeline. What really impressed me about what Stuart was saying, and I can see how OMR and Violation Tracker work together, is that the investor relations departments are now beginning to take notice of what he's doing, and that is real power, because that means that the institutions are taking notice, and if the institutions are taking notice, you will see change. But it's only if the owners take notice and the directors take notice that anything will happen, because it's a question of morality. We talked about Barclays. It so happens, and I try to help somebody. When I was at the CIJ, we were instrumental in helping set up UK. I'm just trying to remember it. UK whistleblowers, and there's a very good chap there whose name is just I've lost, who has recently had Ian Foxley, who's recently, after 9 years, been vindicated in the whistleblowing that he did about a telecommunications project he was involved in, I think, Saudi Arabia. And he's just been vindicated, but it's taken ages. One of my friends is a man called Dino Bossi. And Dino doesn't sound like it, but is actually a colonel in the Welsh Guards, and who lost 8 men when the Afghan police he was training turned against his men in Afghanistan. And as a result of that, he was asked to set up an informants program by David Petraeus, General Petraeus. And that's the program. He was then recruited into Barclays by the then CEO, whose name again has escaped me. And he set up the program, which was based on his informants program in Afghanistan, where, of course, the penalties were pretty bad. I mean, he lost 2 of his interpreters, and they were found hanging up with tires burning beneath them, roasted to death. So it was a pretty tight system. And he caught Staley. And that's the system that caught Staley. Now, you would think that he'd be carried on the shoulders of victory up to the boardroom and given a gold medal, but he wasn't. He was slowly squeezed out. And he then helped set up his own whistleblowing program.
Wow.
I tried to help him. I took him round to people I know who are chairman of companies, and none of them were interested. They're simply not interested. One of my friends is a man called Victor Blank. So Victor Blank, who was chief executive was chairman of Lloyd's Bank. And they just weren't interested. They turned against it. Whistleblowing still sinks. So it's a question of morality. Barclays don't give a damn about whistleblowing. They don't give a damn about corruption. I'm absolutely sure of it. The Abu Dhabi case pretty well proved that. They were lucky to get away with it. Another good friend, I'm dropping names, but it's absolutely true. I've been around a long time. One of my old friends, Professor Sir Roland Smith, was chairman of British Aerospace. And bribery is endemic in the arms industry, as Al Yamama proved. I mean, it was such an embarrassing deal. And such an embarrassing case that by order of the Prime Minister it was dropped because it implicated and involved such senior people in countries that are allies. So it's terribly, terribly difficult to do anything about it unless we can adjust morality. In my view, we will only adjust morality if we go to the owners and put their feet to the fire and go to the directors personally and put their feet to the fire.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian.
And by the way, last point,
yeah.
I fear that Phil will discover that the UK is to the US what Cloche-Merle is to the UK. I mean, it's a village. It is a very tiny very tightly controlled country, And the best authority on that is Prem Sikka, Lord Sikka, who's our great friend and supporter, who's done more work on the interrelationship between companies and the regulatory authorities than anyone. He's demonstrated that the regulatory authorities are really controlled. And one of my experience in that is that I launched KPMG many, many years ago through a company, and the chap who I was reporting to there became head of taxation, became senior partner, and then unbelievably became chairman of HMRC. So, you know, it's very, very difficult.
Brian, thank you very much indeed. Your input is always so helpful. Brian mentioned Prem Sikka, now Lord Sikka. We're huge fans of Prem Sikka. He's a world leader when it comes to evaluating the ineffectiveness, frankly, of the audit profession and the governance profession. And the reason I mention that is because one of the things on our scribble pad that the Violation Tracker UK Advisory Board has got, one of the kind of wish list ideas, and I doubt if this will be first time round, it might be second, third iteration, if never, is the idea of knowing who the audit firm was when the violation took place. We think that would be really useful information. I also would love the idea of knowing who the MD, chief exec and chairman was when the violation took place, to try to do exactly what Brian's talking about, to try to connect, make a correlation between the individuals running the organization and what that organization did on their watch. I'm going to repeat that. What they did on their watch. You know, the primary duty of the board of an organization is to keep it out of trouble, and Violation Tracker shows which organization have allowed themselves to get into trouble. We're going to go back to Stuart. Stuart, take a few minutes if you wish to wrap up your thoughts in response to the excellent points that have been made by some of our attendees and guests tonight. Stuart, back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I mean, not really much more to say. I mean, just fascinating hearing from lots of people. I mean, I think, you know, coming back to this idea of, you know, how do we engender change? How do we get organizations to change? How do we get people to change? And I think Brian has articulated a number of the systemic problems that we have. You know, our whole approach has been to, you know, companies were never interested in what we wanted to do. We were holding up a mirror to them and saying, you know, how you manage your organizations from a human perspective is something we want to look at. You know, boards and CEOs weren't interested in that level of sensitivity and that level of mirror being shown to them. You know, that's changed in the last few years, literally the last few years, partly because we've gone to the investment community and said this stuff matters and it should be taken into account in terms of how you value companies, because they're carrying significant risk. And that needs to be reflected in your valuations. That's made a profound difference. So as soon as equity analysts start sending out OMINDEX analysis to investor relations teams, they say, well, we really need to know about this methodology. We need to get to grips with these questions. So that's an important dynamic. I think it's been interesting just listening to Gareth. You know, I think the pension industry has got a huge, you know, what pension mandates and defining what a responsible business is. You know, we're starting to measure that. We're starting to say, what does, you know, how can we define what responsible is and what's acceptable from a pensions perspective? You know, you know, Brian mentioned, you know, boards and CEOs not caring. You know, increasingly they're being forced to account for the harm they create to the outside world, environmentally and in human terms. We've got to keep pushing that forward. It's unacceptable. Not only is it unacceptable, it's bad for the organizations. Actually, it's bad for shareholders, because they're losing so much value and they're carrying a risk, which is increasingly being priced in. So I think, you know, I'm always a naive optimist. I'm always, you know, let's keep pushing. There's lots of levers that we need to push, you know, from pension fund mandates through to boards, CEOs, how they're paid, on what basis they're paid. And I think, you know, we've got to be coming back to the idea of transparency and opening up, you know, what's the world really look like? Because, you know, I mean, I'll give you an example. In the last week, there was a report issued by the Purposeful Company. So an organization of prestigious people Will Hutton, Alex Edmonds, Andy Haldane, I think is part of that, and held up 14 UK firms saying we're all purposeful. Barclays was one of them. RBS was one of them. You know, it's ludicrous. It completely undermines the message, which is we've got to be saying, you know, who are responsible, who are genuinely purposeful, and who are the companies we ought to get behind. So, yeah, I mean, I think we've got a long way to go. I think Violation Tracker is great. Shining a light is great. And Gareth, you know, I think your organisation's really important, as is organisations like the Chartered Bankers Institute and professional bodies and trade bodies. We've got to all come together. It's the only way we're gonna make a difference. And we've got to show how responsible business is not just what we want, but it's good for us all. But there's huge systemic barriers. There's huge things to overcome across every single facet of society. So it ain't easy.
Stuart, thank you so much for your extensive contributions to tonight's discussion and debate. Can we please show our appreciation for Stuart and his presentation? Thank you very, very much indeed, Stuart. Great job. Really, really great job. Love hearing about your work. Stuart, don't hesitate to put links into the chat where people can get to find out more if they'd like to. We've got lots of folks that would like to say something, which is super duper. We're going to go to Pauline Creasy, then to Anne-Marie Borg, then to Gareth Tancred, then to Greg all the way in Washington, DC. So Pauline Creasy, please introduce yourself and make your point. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much, Andy. I've been having trouble with my laptop, so I couldn't raise the flag. I'm so sorry. I'm just very interested to ask someone in the States and someone in the UK, if they can, how interested are the SEC and how interested are the FCA in Violation Tracker? And have they been helpful in actually, you know, developing it, for example, in the States? And if anybody's got any information on the attitude of the FCA, I'd be absolutely thrilled. And I should say the reason why I'm asking, I'm actually from the aerospace industry, so I was very interested and intrigued by what was being said earlier, and totally agree with it. I don't actually work in that part of it. I'm in the space and communication side. I should quickly say, not been out in Saudi recently, but I'm also the chair of the Premier FX Financial Committee. And we were party to a very nasty fraud in the FX industry, and it's actually been perpetrated by a small to medium-sized firm. And I guess that would be like a supplementary question: is how do you capture those smaller firms who are so clever at being elusive and evading the radar? And I think most of what Violation Tracker has been talking about has been about the bigger corporations. And I'm not necessarily trying to overload you with more work right now when you're doing such a good job, but it's something to consider, isn't it, in the future, that a lot of financial crime, particularly in Europe, particularly in the UK, is committed by medium and small companies because they are under the radar. If I could go back to my original question, was how supportive has the SEC been in what you've been doing in the States? And if anybody's got any information on, you know, the attitudes of the FCA to Violation Tracker coming to the UK, I'd be most interested. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to Phil for the comments about the SEC. Pauline, I was speaking to the FCA today, not about Violation Tracker, but I'm pleased to say that there's a very high chance that the chief exec of the FCA is going to be speaking at a TTF event in due course. So that will be a great opportunity to run it by him then, if he doesn't get to hear about it already. So that's good news, Pauline. That's good news. Let's go to Phil. Phil, SEC and other financial regulators, have they been involved, interested, engaged at all, supportive or not? What do you think?
Well, first, let me answer the question about the small firms, because I don't want to let that go unaddressed. We collect data from when we collect data from the agencies, we collect data on all their cases, whether they involve a small firm or a large firm. And we incorporate all that data into the Violation Tracker database. And we do that in the US, and we're doing that for the UK data as well. But then when we aggregate the data, we do that for a selected universe of larger companies. But the smaller entries are still there and are still searchable. So they don't disappear. We don't discard those entries because they're not linked to a large company. I just wanted to make that clear. As far as the SEC is concerned, we haven't had much direct contact with them. We think now with the new administration and the new head of the SEC, Gary Gensler, there's maybe a chance, greater chance for contact, and we'll hope to pursue that. There's also, we haven't had any contact with the FCA. Our approach in most cases is to just work with publicly available information. And with these agencies, there are archives of announcements, case announcements, and we just go through those methodically and extract the relevant information and assemble it. The cases where the information is not readily available online is where we have to engage more with the agency.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you, Pauline, for your points. Very interesting indeed. Let's now go to Anne-Marie Borg. Anne-Marie, lovely to have you with us. Please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Anne-Marie Borg from the Antara project, which I created, which focuses mainly on communication and education, change in the education system. I have a background in commercial and international law. I'm also focused on creativity and how we introduce all those things into the education system. My question is about the environment. I'm an ocean preservation speaker. And I was just, because you spoke, several of you spoke about the crime against the environment. I was just wondering, because we're getting to a point where the crime of ecocide is going to probably be recognized now internationally. Is there any point in actually getting in touch with Ecocide in England to actually get some information about the data they actually have? It's a very strong organization, and I'm sure they have quite a lot of data which is available.
Let's go to Phil for a comment on that. And if Phil hasn't been in contact, is there somebody perhaps you might be able to introduce Phil to, Anne-Marie?
Yes, definitely, yes.
Phil, is this?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of the organization, and but I haven't had contact with them yet. So it would be great to do that and find out what they have.
Great.
One of the dilemmas that we have with the data in the US is that there are actually very few regulations about things like greenhouse gas emissions.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have a lot of violations in the database on that subject because there are few rules and regulations to violate. Okay. So there aren't the cases that are brought. Our Environmental Protection Agency does collect information on emissions, but that's not within the scope of the data that we collect. So we wish there were more cases on climate-related cases, but the law has to.
I'll find out some more. I'll get more information and get back to you. Absolutely.
That's very helpful indeed, Anne-Marie. Thank you. Alexandra, could you please connect Anne-Marie and Phil by email so they can talk further about Ecocide? I didn't even know that exists. That was available there. Wonderful, Anne-Marie. Thank you so much. We're now going to go to Gareth. Just before Gareth speaks, a lot of my career has been spent in the pensions industry, and I'm very impressed by the work that the Pensions Management Institute has been doing to help drive forward reform and change through better qualifications, better education. Gareth, are your members becoming more ESG orientated? And if so, what is the extent to which Violation Tracker might become relevant to them in some way? And what else would you like to say about this general topic? Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, yes, they definitely are. I mean, gone are the days where pension trustees were just monitoring the performance of funds that were being invested in, and the usual triennial valuations, etc., etc. There is far more emphasis now on ESG, and part of the problem here is that ESG data, I think, as Phil was referring to a minute ago, it can be quite patchy. And with the advent of big data, there's a lot of data, but trying to understand it and analyze it can be very difficult indeed. So I see a massive role here for the Violation Tracker. And whilst in the early days it might be difficult to get some of the data that's needed, I mean, Phil mentioned about greenhouse gas emissions, for example, you know, where organisations are bad polluters or they are fined for you know, things like that, and certainly in the case of, you know, employment standards or corruption or things like that, you know, that data is likely to be available, and therefore it'll give trustees a much better insight into many of the organisations that you know, they're either representing or that you know, are being invested in. I think there's a couple of things here as well, Andy. I think you know, for trustees, you know, when they're making decisions about, you know, where to invest, typically they'll rely on other people such as fund managers. So, you know, I think what we'll start to see is this sort of pressure chain, you know, from you know, maybe shareholders, trustees, fund managers. Everybody's got to be alert to this more. So I can see a massive role for the violation tracker in the middle of all of this. Just our organisation alone, the trustees that we represent are looking after something like £1.5 trillion worth you know, of investments, and that's a massive amount of money. So because those funds are huge investors in their own right, there is growing pressure. It's never really gone away. There's growing pressure on trustees to make sure that you know, where they're investing, that you know, that they're ethical and meet good ESG standards. This is a growing area, so I can only see that the violation tracker will be a good thing. I guess just to come back on Stuart's point as well, Stuart made some really powerful points a few minutes ago. But for professional bodies, this is the kind of area where you know, we should start to become really active, because you know, we can bring a lot of these people together. In our case, you know, for pensions professionals, it's trustees, lawyers, actuaries, admin, employee benefits consultants. It's a broad church, and we've really only focused on trustees, you know, in the last few minutes. But for us, in our organisation, we have 5 objectives we're trying to achieve, and one of those objectives is to make a difference to the economy and society. Now, you might ask, what can a small professional body do to make a difference to the economy or society? We're not Barclays Bank, you know, we're not a massive organisation. We're a small professional body. But here's how we can make a difference. We can find our piece of the jigsaw, and then we can contribute to it. And we can make sure that things like violation tracker, you know, get the emphasis that it needs, and that I mean, one thing I did in a previous body, it wasn't the PMI, but it was to do with living wage, for example, that you have to sign up to the living wage if you want to continue being a member of our organisation. And it took us 2 or 3 years to do it, but that's how we started to make a difference in society. And I can see something like this, you know, if other bodies like ourselves can adapt it and make sure that our members use it and they get value from it, I can see this being hugely powerful.
Gareth, thank you so much. These are wonderfully supportive comments. I genuinely think there's a really strong alignment between the value system at the PMI, which I've known about and known well for many years, and what the folks at Violation Tracker are doing. With your permission, what we'll do, Gareth, is set up a call. Alexander, could you pick that up as an action, if you don't mind, to look to organise a conversation between myself, Greg, Phil, and Gareth, just to see what that piece of the jigsaw might be? That would be a really useful thing to do.
Yeah, happy to do that.
That's very kind, Gareth. Thank you very much. Let's go to Greg Leroy. I remember vividly the very first conversation I had with Greg. It's when I stumbled across Violation Tracker. I was absolutely blown away by it. I still am. The potential remains absolutely enormous. And what I was so pleased to have when I had this, you know, cold call conversation to Greg, to tell him about our book and to tell him about our work and to tell him about how aligned we seem to be based upon what I was reading about Violation Tracker on the website. And I got this wonderfully enthusiastic, engaging response. How refreshing that was, you know? So often you reach out to people kind of cold and you just get a cold shoulder, but it was the absolute opposite. It was an immediate synergy and an immediate chemistry there. And I'm so pleased that we find ways to work together over the last 12 months to get to where we are now. So Greg, please take a moment to introduce yourself and tell everybody about your role within Violation Tracker, your background, and where you see the Violation Tracker UK project going. And let me put you on the spot. I know it's early days. Why don't you say something about Europe as well? Go on.
So just for everybody's benefit, I also remember my first conversation with Andy after we had our first email exchange. And in fact, I think I still had to put, Velcro on my lapels here, because he was like literally reaching through the screen and shaking me by the lapels saying, when is there going to be a Violation Tracker UK? Not whether, but when. And it was sort of, that was the beginning of the conversation. That was the first base of it. And it's been amazing to meet many of you individually in conversations that we've had, in the many scores of conversations that we've had with new allies in the UK. And as I said earlier today, during a steering committee meeting we had, or an advisory committee meeting we had for this project, we are light years ahead as a project now. When we launch Violation Tracker, which we tentatively are saying October now as a rollout date, we are light years ahead of where we were in the States, where we had one funder betting on us and a few friends that liked what we were doing, but nothing at all like TTF's network and all the people who have signed on and endorsed the project. So we're so well positioned to make this more effective, more useful, better known, right out of the blocks. I just want to say too, in addition to the kinds of users that Phil talked about, even though we haven't had much contact with the SEC, some regulators we know are heavy users. The Environmental Protection Agency, last we could tell, was a very heavy user. We know that we demonstrated the database for the what's called like Occupational Safety and Health Administration, our workplace safety regulators here. And the director of that agency liked it so much, he had us give a webinar for all 26 of his field offices the next week, because they have to separate wheat from chaff. They need to look for the recidivists. And because of our parent subsidiary matching system, they can quickly tell who owns whom and really focus on the repeat offenders that they need to focus on. We also know that state and local governments use it to vet companies that they're looking at for regulatory privileges, or looking at for economic development incentives, or looking at for zoning privileges. Yes, it's true. One day, Bank of America emailed me saying, "Why haven't you posted that new violation by Wells Fargo yet?" As in, they'll look worse and we'll look less worse when you do. We know that banks themselves, including some dirty banks like Deutsche Bank, are heavy users of the database for doing risk management and vetting companies that they're looking at, and certainly reputation defense firms. I mean, I think Phil's point about we're not getting blowback is true, because I think companies understand there's so much public information out there now. The internet's really changed that whole dynamic, and it's all about reputation defense, and reputation defense firms use the database as well. I want to close by saying, before I talk about Europe for a second, that we don't, this is not just a talking group. We want, and as I put in the chat box, we've been continuing to build out Violation Tracker. It's 6 times bigger today than it was when we originally launched it, partly because we could add so many state sources as well as federal sources. But we want your guidance. And we're not doing this as an idle exercise or just to be a cool thing for people to have, write better fact sheets or write better, ESG reports. Although we love the fact that so many ESG providers are using it, and we think it will influence the debate. We think it is a better mousetrap. But I know there's people on the call here today who have real agendas and real reform possibilities in the near future around workplace safeguards, around pension safeguards, around banking reforms, around corruption safeguards. And we would love the database to be a tool in those campaigns. And to the extent you can help us make the database better, or prioritize additional sources, or shape reports with us using the data. I mean, we want to start publishing with it as well, as once it gets up, in the same way we have published ourselves, as have so many other people with the data once it's alive. We want to partner with you, because like I say, we are light years ahead on the ground in the UK now compared to where we were 6 years ago in the States. And finally, to Andy's question about the EU, we've had numerous conversations with organizations whose mission spans Europe and other countries, especially from the ESG world and the ratings world, the ethical ratings world, and so on. And we've actually taken a quick scan at some of the data in the EU, and it's quite differently structured than it is in America and the UK and other former British colonies, who seem to have their own different legal structures, as you might imagine. So we're interested in that. We're looking at that. We're mindful of that. It would be complicated, but it's not unthinkable. And we certainly welcome those conversations. It's going to take more support. We're a small organization. This is a big infrastructure. We're in this for the long run. We've had 4 databases online for a total of about 19 or 20 years now. But once you create these databases, you have to keep feeding the beasts, and that means maintenance, support, and infrastructure, because Phil needs help.
Thank you very much indeed, Greg. Thank you. One of the members of our Violation Tracker UK advisory board is Stefan Voicu, who's with Better Finance, the Brussels-based pan-European pro-consumer investment lobbying group. A great organization. We're associate members. And the reason that Stefan is on the Violation Tracker UK advisory board, even though he's a European, is because of these conversations we're having about the possibilities of Violation Tracker coming to Europe as well. And then what about Canada? What about Australia? What about the Far East? Who knows? Who knows where this is going to go? We've pretty much managed things perfectly time-wise. So what we're going to do in a moment is we're going to kind of formally wrap the session up. But what we'll do is keep the channel open for another 15 minutes or so, or for however long people want to chat. We'll keep the channel open for those that may want to converse afterwards. We'll keep the recording going because somebody might say something really useful, really interesting, and I'll draw into the conversations those that haven't yet had a chance to say anything. So the channel's going to stay open. We'll keep going, but at this point we're kind of formally ending the structured part of the session. So let me say my final formal bits by saying thank you to all of you once again for your support and engagement on this very, very important topic. Let's give all of ourselves a round of applause. Thank you very, very much indeed. Now, there's a few things that one or two folks I'd like to hear about if possible. Andy Candy, if you're able to, please come onto the session because I'd be keen to get your thoughts about the way that graphics and design can help to show the data in a pretty compelling way. And if anybody else has not had a chance to say something, please do. For example, we might want to hear from Mikhail Rogatko, or from Ray Pollock, or from Diane, or from Donna Bradshaw. Anybody really, now's a chance to say whatever it is you may wish to say. So would anybody like to say something? It's entirely up to you if you do, of course. Mikhail, did you want to say something? Yes, go for it.
I just may say hello. I'm from Poland. I'm involved in corporate governance issues.
Yes.
And in the Polish Society of Joint of Listed Companies at Warsaw Stock Exchange. And so it's pretty much want to learn about TTF.
Yeah, very good.
I'm very much impressed by latest tracker. It's really impressive too.
Very good. And we know that you're a friend of Krzysztof Grabowski, our ambassador in Poland. We know Krzysztof very, very well. And I'm very pleased he's introduced you to us. Thank you very much. Let's go to anybody else that would like to say anything, if there is anybody. Otherwise, we can bring matters to a close. It's been a very, very successful meeting from my point of view. I've enjoyed everybody's company. I've enjoyed everybody's input. It looks like we're all good. So why don't we wrap it up there, folks? Thank you so, so, so much. I'll say cheerio again, okay? Good night, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Have a good one. Thanks very much indeed, folks. Thank you. Good night. Good night.